I was never handsome or smart. They made fun of me at school and in the yard. I got used to it. But every time I had to endure humiliation, something inside broke, became cold and stale. I learned not to show my pain, to hide it deep inside. But when my wife cheated on me with my brother, who was better than me in everything since childhood, I could not contain myself and took revenge on both of them.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes. Dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
Since childhood, I have always felt like an outsider in this world, as if I was born in the wrong place. I wasn't handsome enough to be chased by girls, and I wasn't smart enough to be proud of my grades and victories at Olympiads. At school, my classmates laughed at me, pointing fingers at my acne and crooked posture. In the rare moments when someone tried to show kindness, I felt even more humiliated, as if I were an object of pity rather than an equal member of society. I had learned to tolerate ridicule and let it pass, but inside, each lunge left a deep wound. These wounds did not heal, but instead made me callous and cold. I became closed and aloof, trying to hide my pain behind a mask of indifference. Each new humiliation was like a nail driven into my soul. At some point I stopped believing that people could be kind or sincere. All I saw in their eyes was disdain or, even worse, pity. I tried to socialize less, avoiding crowded places, preferring solitude. Often I locked myself in my room and could sit by the window for hours, looking out at the street. I had almost no friends, and the ones I had could hardly be called real. They were more like me, outcasts with whom I shared only a common sense of hopelessness and rejection. My parents noticed that something was wrong with me, but they didn't know how to help. My father, a rigid and demanding man, considered me weak and constantly criticized me for not being able to pull myself together. My mother, on the contrary, tried to support me, but her efforts only made things worse. Her concern seemed ostentatious to me, because I could see how she was ashamed of her failed son. As a result, I withdrew even further into my inner world, where there was no room for pain and disappointment. When I entered university, it seemed to me that it was a chance to start again, to find myself and my place in life. But it didn't turn out to be that simple. At university, I remained as unassuming and inconspicuous as before. I knew I wouldn't be popular among the students, but I still hoped for the best. Instead, I became an object of ridicule here as well. Only now those taunts were more subtle and sarcastic. I learned to be patient, to suppress resentment and anger, and to concentrate on my studies. My only salvation was literature, where I could find solace in other people's stories and experiences. I met Emma in my second year when our group came together for a project. She stood out from the rest of the students with her beauty and confidence. I knew I wasn't right for her, that she was the kind of person who could have chosen someone more successful and attractive, but she herself showed interest in me. It was unexpected and frankly overwhelming. Emma was one of the few people who didn't make fun of me or treat me with contempt. She was friendly, open, and I thought, genuinely interested in me. We began to socialize, first through academic tasks and then outside of university. Emma was an intelligent and interesting conversationalist, and I felt that I could be myself around her without hiding my complexes and fears. She told me that she liked my special appearance, and I, though with difficulty, began to believe that there could be something attractive in me. Our relationship developed slowly but surely, and after a while we started dating. At that moment, I felt like life had finally turned around for me. Emma became everything to me, the only person I could be honest and open with. I felt like she saw something more in me than the others. She saw my wounds and didn't push me away for them. It was amazing and a little scary, but I dared to trust her. Emma became my rock, and when she suggested we get married after graduation, I accepted without hesitation. Our marriage was quiet and peaceful. We did not quarrel, we lived a measured life, immersed in everyday life. We had no children, and perhaps that was what kept us from having major conflicts. Emma took care of the house, and I tried to bring in money, even if not as much as I would have liked. I realized that our marriage lacked passion, but I thought that was normal for people like us. We were just two loners finding each other in this cold world. Nick, my brother, was the complete opposite of me. He was always successful, popular, and confident. Ever since I was a kid, I felt like I was in his shadow, constantly comparing our accomplishments and always being the underdog. Nick was the favorite of my parents, especially my father, who didn't hide his pride in his eldest son. I, on the other hand, was perceived as a failure who could not live up to the family's expectations. Our relationship with Nick was complicated. Even though I felt jealous of him, I tried to hide it and maintain a semblance of friendship. Nick was someone I aspired to be, but also hated for achieving so easily what I couldn't. He was someone I would never be, and it constantly depressed me. We socialized, but there was always an underlying tension between us that only grew stronger over time. When Emma and I got married, Nick started coming to visit us often. He was charming and friendly, easily finding common ground with my wife. I could see her smiling at his jokes, the way they talked, and it made me uncomfortable. But I chased those thoughts away from me, not wanting to believe there could be anything more than friendship between them. Nick had always been attractive to women, and it seemed to me that Emma just enjoyed being around someone like him. After all, I was her husband, and she had chosen me despite everything. Every now and then, however, I noticed how they would linger in conversation, how Nick would stay over late. I tried to justify it with their common interests, their mutual affection as relatives. But deep inside, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, but I didn't want to admit it. Emma was becoming more and more distant, and our conversations were reduced to trivial questions about home and work. I chalked it up to routine, to the fact that passion fades with time, and that it happens to everyone. That rainy evening, when I came home earlier than usual, my suspicions were confirmed. It was pouring rain, and I was soaked by the time I got home. I felt uneasy in the entryway, as if some invisible force was pulling me back, warning me of trouble. But I ignored the feeling, writing it off as fatigue and bad mood. When I opened the apartment door, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. The house was strangely quiet, even though Emma was usually watching TV or listening to music at this time. But today, the silence was weighing on me, making my heart beat faster. I headed toward the bedroom, and the closer I got, the stronger that strange, unsettling sound became. I heard a soft chuckle and a whisper coming from behind the door, and I froze. Everything inside me turned upside down. For the first time in my life, I felt real fear mixed with panic. But I couldn't just stand there, so I pushed the door open and walked in. The picture that opened in front of me hit me right in the heart. On the bed, half undressed, lay my wife, Emma. Nick, my brother, was leaning over her, his hand on her thigh. They both froze when they saw me, but there was no shame on their faces, no fear. I saw something else in their eyes, indifference. It was as if they knew it was going to happen and were ready for it. Emma made no attempt to cover herself up or get out of bed, and Nick just straightened up, throwing me a look that was both defiant and dismissive. In that moment, all my fears and suspicions turned to rage. The world around me darkened, and I felt my hand clench into a fist. I don't remember walking up to Nico, but the next thing I realized was my fist hitting his face. I punched him over and over, not hearing his screams or Emma's cries. The only thing I wanted in that moment was to wipe him off the face of the earth, to destroy the man who had taken everything I had from me. All the years of pain, humiliation, and resentment I had endured found an outlet in this insane rage. When I finally stopped, Nick was lying on the floor, barely breathing, his face covered in blood, and Emma was sitting on the bed with her arms around her head, sobbing. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard, feeling the anger slowly let go, leaving behind nothing but emptiness. But along with the emptiness came the realization that I had lost everything. The brother I had once loved and respected had betrayed me in the most despicable way. The wife I'd trusted was a cheater, willing to cheat for the sake of a moment's pleasure. Dan, Emma said quietly, keeping her head down. I don't know what to say. Her voice shook, and I could see that she was afraid, but it didn't give me any satisfaction. I didn't care about her fear and remorse, because in that moment I realized that there was nothing left between us anymore. No feelings, no commitment. Just emptiness and disgust. You destroyed everything, I said coldly, not looking at her. You and Nick. Emma sobbed and finally looked up at me. Tears glistened in her eyes, but I didn't see what I wanted to see in them: true remorse. She may have been sorry for what had happened, but it wasn't the guilt I'd expected. She was sorry for herself, sorry she'd been caught, but she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. I didn't know how it happened, she started, but I held up my hand, silencing her. It doesn't matter, I said, feeling my voice growing more and more icy. You're dead to me. Get out of here. She froze, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing, but I was serious. I couldn't bear to see her around anymore. Every look she gave me, every word she said only added to my pain and disgust. I turned away from her and walked out of the room, leaving her there, alone. I needed to leave, to get out of this cursed house where everything reminded me of her betrayal. I didn't know where I was going. I walked through the streets, not noticing the pouring rain that kept pelting me, as if trying to wash away everything that had happened. My head was filled with memories of the times when I'd believed that Emma and I were okay, when I'd been sure she loved me. But now those memories felt alien, like it was another person's life. I felt an unbearable pain wash over me with each step. The pain of being so naive as not to notice what was happening under my nose. But that pain was soon replaced by something else, anger. I knew I couldn't just walk away from this. I knew I had to punish them both for what they had done. For taking away the only thing I cared about. Revenge, I thought at the time, was going to be the medicine that would heal my wounded soul. I planned it long and carefully, thinking through every step, every detail. First, I decided to deal with Nick. He had to pay for his betrayal. I learned that he had recovered in the hospital, but after my attack, his career had gone down the drain. Nick, who had been a successful lawyer, was now suffering from panic attacks and couldn't work properly. At some point I realized that his life was already ruined, but that wasn't enough for me. I wanted him to feel the same pain I felt. I started sending him anonymous threatening letters, forcing him to live in constant fear. I watched him slowly go insane, and it gave me some kind of perverse satisfaction. Things were more complicated with Emma. She was trying to get her life together after I kicked her out of the house. Our paths crossed sometimes, and I could see that she was avoiding me. But I could still see the fear in her eyes. She didn't know what I was planning, and it was driving her crazy. I started calling her at night without saying a word, only breathing into the receiver. I knew she couldn't sleep well, that she was having nightmares, and that gave me the strength to keep going. I started coming to her new house, leaving notes on the door to let her know I was there for her. One night I went to her house again, deciding that this time I would go further than just leaving a note. I felt I needed to see her suffering with my own eyes. But as I approached her house, I saw her standing on the porch talking to someone. It was an unfamiliar man, and he was holding her hand. I froze, watching them from the shadows. There was no fear in her eyes, only relief and gratitude. I realized she had found comfort in someone else, and it made me feel even more humiliated. She was able to forget me, able to get on with her life, while I was bogged down in my memories and thirst for revenge. In that moment, I realized that I had lost not only her, but myself. I stood there, hiding in the shadows, and felt my hatred for her begin to fade, leaving behind an emptiness and disappointment. The next day I packed my things and left town. I realized that there was nothing left for me here anymore. I had lost everything, and there was no point in staying any longer. I left to a place where no one knew me, where I could start over. But even there, in this new place, I couldn't get rid of the thoughts of what had happened. Memories of the night I caught Emma with Nick haunted me, turning each new day into a continuation of the nightmare. Over time, I began to realize that my revenge hadn't brought me relief. It only compounded my pain, making it even more unbearable. I had ruined not only their lives, but my own as well. I became a loner, lost in my own misery, and every day that feeling grew stronger. At some point, I realized that the only way to find peace was to let go of everything that had happened. But that was easier said than done. I tried to find solace in work, in new hobbies, but nothing worked. My soul was poisoned with hate, and I couldn't get rid of it. I started seeing a therapist, hoping he could help me sort myself out. Those sessions were hard, but slowly I began to realize that my problem wasn't just Emma and Nick. It was in me, in the way I perceived the world and the people around me. I had spent my whole life feeling rejected and unwanted, and this feeling had colored all my relationships in dark tones. I expected betrayal, feared it, and in the end, I pushed things to happen. Sessions with a therapist were a painful necessity, but they began to bear fruit. I began to realize that forgiveness was not an excuse for those who had hurt me, but a way to free myself from it. Forgiveness is not for them, but for me. I realized that by clinging to hate, I was only continuing to torment myself, keeping the fire burning me from the inside out. One evening, after a particularly difficult session, I sat on a park bench watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon. I thought about the days when Emma and Nick and I were close, when I believed I had a family to love and rely on. I realized that I had held on to that illusion for too long, and that it was probably what had led to our destruction. I didn't see the real people behind my expectations, and when they didn't live up to them, I came down on them with the rage that had built up in me over the years. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It was an agonizing process made up of many small steps. I began by writing a letter to Nick. In that letter, I apologized to him for not being able to hold myself together, for letting my anger take over. I didn't condone what he had done, but I tried to understand that he was probably unhappy and confused too, just like me. I didn't send that letter, but writing it was the first step for me to let go of the hate. Then I decided to confront Emma. It was a hard decision, but I knew I had to do it if I wanted to truly let go of the past. I called her and suggested we meet at the very park I had frequented over the past few months. She agreed, and we met there, on the very bench where I first realized the need for forgiveness. Emma looked calmer than I'd expected, but there was still a shadow of guilt in her eyes. We were silent for a long time, each of us trying to find the right words. Finally, she was the first to break the silence. Dan, I know I've said this before, but I'm really sorry for what happened. I know I can't fix anything, but please know that I am truly remorseful. I listened to her and realized that I no longer felt the pain that burned me before. Forgiveness was slowly filling the void that hatred had left. I looked at Emma and saw before me not a traitor, but a woman who had also gone through her trials, made her mistakes, and paid her price for them. I'm sorry too, Emma, I said finally. I'm sorry I couldn't be better for us. But I don't want to carry around hate anymore. I forgive you. And I forgive myself, too. Her eyes filled with tears and she smiled slightly, nodding in agreement. We talked some more, discussing how her life had turned out since our breakup, and I was glad to know that she had found her happiness. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a relief. I felt like I could now move on, leaving the past behind me. We exchanged brief words of goodbye and I left the park, feeling the weight I had carried on my shoulders for so long gradually disappear. Forgiveness was the beginning of a new journey for me. I was no longer the person who clung to grudges and hatred. I began to rebuild my life, slowly and carefully. I went back to work, found new hobbies that brought me joy. I began to appreciate the simple moments like walking in the park, meeting new people, reading books. All of these things gradually gave my life meaning. I also realized that I needed to learn how to build healthy relationships based on trust and mutual respect. At first it was hard to trust someone new, but I tried. Over time, I met a woman who was completely different for me, calm, understanding, and patient. We started dating, and although I was cautious at first, I gradually began to open up to her. With her, I felt truly free, not afraid to be vulnerable. The past still occasionally reminded me of itself, but I no longer let it control my life. I learned to let go of resentment and live in the present. That evening, as I sat on the riverbank and watched the sunset, I realized that I had finally found peace. I was no longer the person who let fears and resentments run my life. I was now a person who had learned to forgive, and that made me truly free.